Last week, President Trump signed a Pentagon directive ordering that department to go after drug cartels in Latin America. The government is hoping that by targeting these so-called cartels, they can stop the illicit flow of drugs that is undoubtedly pouring into U.S. cities. But although it's billed as a departure from previous administration's drug enforcement policies, Trump's plan is very much a continuation of the drug policies favored by Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and before him, George W. Bush, who, under the guise of defeating these supposedly powerful drug cartels, have militarized the Mexican government. That's all inflamed the violence rather than curtailed it. As my guest today, Oswaldo Zavala from the City University of New York, explains.
Most journalism, when it tries to understand the drug war, what it usually does is it goes to the institutions peddling the very policy, right? And it goes to the DA, goes to the Mexican side, goes to all the people involved in articulating and carrying on the war itself, quote unquote war. And it does not really try to figure out the history behind a lot of the struggles, a lot of the social movements. But not only that, we wrongly attribute most of the violence to traffickers without even any verification, right? And that's, for me, it's even perhaps the biggest failure of contemporary journalism.
Right. I mean, the mythology is that there's these all-powerful drug cartels that are committing all of the violence or the majority of the violence. But as you mentioned in your book, which we can start to get into now, there's plenty of human rights reports. Obviously, as you say, journalists aren't really covering this properly. They're just repeating official
Right.
sources and official narratives. But human rights reports like Amnesty International have documented these extrajudicial killings by the police and by the Mexican state. And speaking of which, there have been over 400,000 people who have been killed in recent years from this violence. And like we've been talking about, it's all attributed pretty much to these cartels, which are just said to be extremely powerful organizations with, as you write about in your book, they're said to have these tentacles in just dozens of countries, just so powerful that even the Mexican state can't control them, that the cartels are even in fact challenge the sovereignty of the Mexican government. That's really the official reading of the cartels and their power, and media representations just generally reinforce that understanding. But you did spend many years as a journalist covering so-called cartel violence, and you quickly came to realize that the conventional understanding of how drug cartels interact with the Mexican and U.S. governments and the power challenge cartels supposedly pose to those governments isn't really there at all. It's not true that these supposed cartels don't really control anything. As you say, they manage certain territories, but only because the Mexican government allows them to, whether under the one party PRI rule in the 1980s and 90s or under more recent Democratic administrations. Can you just explain a little bit how that works? How these cartels don't really control things or territories, but they are allowed to manage them?
Yeah, well, in order for really to be able to get a clearer picture of that claim, you need to look back into recent history, and to understand what has gone down since the militarization, the most recent wave of militarization began in 2006. Up until that moment, Mexico was actually experiencing one of the clearest trends for pacification, right? So from 1996 to 2007, violence was actually descending. By violence, I mean homicide in rates were coming down. From 96 to about 2006, our homicide rate not only descended or was reduced significantly from across the nation, but also in what now we consider the hotbeds for the drug trade, right? Like cities like Juarez or Sinaloa, Culiacan, and cities like Monterrey, or even in the state of Tamaulipas. And so, what is really interesting to see, and this is something that is quickly forgotten, when we talk about the drug trade, is that up until 2007, Mexico was actually living one of the best years in terms of being violence free. Not entirely free, but I mean with the normal rate of violence, right? So up until that moment, I think the national murder rate was around 9 killings per 100,000 inhabitants, right, in the country. Now that rate changed dramatically only when the militarization began and only where the soldiers were deployed, right? So, which is something really interesting, right? So, wherever the armed forces and the federal police was sent to supposedly pacify the country, that's exactly where we saw murder rates surge. And that in itself, it's very telling of how the war on drugs must be really seen as a politics of unrest, of deliberately causing mayhem, and in many cases, of course, as a politics of extermination, right? And so, if you follow the trends for homicide in cities like Juarez, it's simply not believable that somehow, because of the war on drugs policy, drug cartels, so-called drug cartels, decided to start killing each other at a rate that had no precedent in history, and that could only be really attributed to the presence of over 10,000 soldiers and federal agents that were sent to the city. Right. So, and I'm not, of course, the first one to say this or claim it. Right. There's been several studies done in Mexico, also in the U.S. I cite a few of them in my book that correlate the presence of the armed forces and the violence being experienced in Mexico from 2006 and on. But what is also very interesting, and again, this comes through, documented evidence from journalists, sociologists, historians, is that in Mexico, historically, traffickers were usually under the control of state structures, right? They were very powerfully in line, with federal police and political structures, so much that they never even attempted to have any political claim to that or any political power or place in that structure, but they were actually subaltern and marginalized by it, right? So up until the late 80s, most traffickers were really working at the expense of their own bodies, of their own structures, and they were always vulnerable to state power, right? So much that most of them ended up in prison or killed, which is really usually how their life trajectory goes, right? So that all changed, in the late 1980s when the Ronald Reagan administration designated drug cartels as a threat to national security. And starting in the 1990s and all across that decade, what we saw was a very consistent, coherent effort from the US to increment the militarization of Mexican society, to push for more public spending on Mexican side for security, for militarization, for military structures, for the Mexican Marines, for all the security apparatus. So by the end of the 1990s, what you had is one of the most powerful armed forces in Mexican history, right? And so, what is very paradoxical about this moment is that our war on drugs, the most violent part of the war on drugs, began precisely at the moment when we had one of the most powerful armies and security apparatus our country had seen. And of course, this security apparatus was not only politically backed by the US, but also financially, right? From the Obama administration and on, Mexico received over $3 billion in aid under the Merida Initiative, right, to help, fight drug cartels. Not only that, of course, there were thousands and thousands of police officers and soldiers trained in the US for that specific purpose. So when we talk about the war on drugs, what we really must understand is that we were taken into an era of militarization led by the US with the support of the US. And in no way this is just our war on drugs, right? In any case, we are fighting our foreign US war on Mexican soil, right? And so by understanding this, right, and then by looking at the death toll that you were just mentioning, nearly 500,000 people killed, over 100,000 forced disappearances registered in the country. Well, you can only then ask, how is it possible that in a century-old history of drug trafficking, drug organizations never behaved this violent, right? Never reached this level of violence, and that this only happens when we have such level of militarization, right? And of course, this militarization process doesn't end, right? It continuously grows, right? It continuously extends its reach, right? Now, our professional armed forces control the southern and the northern borders, right? They militarized the custom entry points. They militarized or and controlled the Mexico City airport. So we're basically under the control of the military forces, and yet we're told to and we're led to believe that traffickers are the ones in control.
Right. And one of the figures who you talk about in your book is actually El Chapo. This is someone who we were told ran this highly sophisticated international cartel in dozens of countries, that he was personally responsible for the bloodiest phase of the drug war,
Yeah.
as well as a major share of drug trafficking into the United States. But really, again, like everything we're talking about today, the closer you look at the official claims made about El Chapo, the more it really falls apart. This is someone who we were told was just extremely elusive, that nobody could catch him. And yet, as you point out in your book, in 2012, just days after this big PR stunt in which President Obama encouraged the Mexican president
Mhm.
to be tougher on drug cartels, Mexican authorities were just suddenly able to capture El Chapo. And then his third and final arrest followed a very similar pattern, in which it was pretty clear that authorities had the ability the whole time to reach out and grab El
Right.
Chapo at any point that they wanted to. And it's all very revealing, um, where he was found and what condition he was in. He was basically living in squalor at the time. This is
Right.
someone, again, that we were told just had billions of dollars hidden and was perhaps the wealthiest person in Mexico. But no one ever found any evidence for that either.
Mexican drug lord El Chapo has somehow managed to hide his fortune. U.S. prosecutors want the kingpin's $14 billion, but that money is missing, according to Mexico's Attorney General.
Billions amassed the last decade. Authorities haven't even been able to find $1 of El Chapo's personal fortune.
And what was clear from his arrest was that El Chapo was also just not a very smart person. And it's kind of hard to believe that he was the criminal mastermind that we were told he was. He didn't even know how to use a cell phone, and he also just never finished elementary school. But before we discuss his trial, which I want to discuss later a bit separately, can you talk a little bit about his arrest, just how bizarre they were, and what they revealed about the supposed power and organization of these drug cartels?
Well, yes, I think you summarized it very nicely. So for years, right, the official discourse was that this was the criminal mind of his generation, right, and probably of the world, and that he led a very extraordinary multinational criminal organization that had already reached over 100 countries in the planet, and that amassed already a fortune of billions of dollars. You will remember that he was also included in the Forbes list of the billionaires, and so what is extraordinary about this is that when the time came for him to be captured, it always happened in very clear political context. Right, in which either by pressure of the U.S. and on the case of that visit in 2012 by President Obama, or when the final capture, when he was apprehended right after Rolling Stone published a very strange piece with Sean Penn and a Mexican actress visiting El Chapo. What you have is that clearly the evidence that the Mexican authorities could have always located El Chapo, and was always within their reach. And so you have to wonder, how is it then that somebody like that was allowed to work, to do the things that we were told did, and somehow was not able to escape the grasp of authority, even though he was supposed to have amassed such fortune and such political influence even. And so what is clear to me in the end is that traffickers like him are usually pawns in a geopolitical scheme, right? And in which security demands from the global north, and in particular from the US, um, put pressure on the Mexican authorities to have, the simulation of a war on drugs, right? Where you have, these powerful enemies scattered in the nation that you must fight continuously, and that justified and legitimized the increase in public spending for security and for armed forces, for the very presence of the military personnel, and that in itself, allows for this policy to go on. So if you take away this enemies, these traffickers, these very powerful organizations from the map quickly, your war on drugs will ends very quickly, right? And so part of, I think, of the brilliance of the war on drugs is that it allows you to continue in a forever war in a horizon that, can be extended as far as you want, not only because you can let these people run free for a while, but because you can quickly replace them as well, right? And something that I noticed in my book is that once El Chapo was captured, you have a lot of the journalists who cover these topics already writing the new book for the new lord, the new drug lord that was really this time the mastermind, and that will replace successfully El Chapo, and how the war would go on, right? And so I think, it's very important to be conscious and aware of that narrative and how it repeats itself. And no matter how contradictory and absurd it is, it continues in many ways because the media coverage justifies it, because every presidential administration embarks in its own version of the war on drugs, and because it has characters that are replaceable constantly, right? On the side of the traffickers as well as on the side of the policemen trying to catch them, right?
Right, right. And it's exactly like Orwell said. The war is not meant to be winnable, it's meant to be
Yeah,
continuous. Let
of
me
course.
ask you about this, because you'd think that the media and prosecutors would have many questions for El Chapo after he was arrested. Someone accused of being the world's largest narco terrorist, but instead he didn't even testify at his own trial. And he was
Right.
limited, in fact, by the federal judge to just a 1 minute statement, which was highly unusual. I've never seen that before. And in his statement, he basically said that the trial was a sham and that there's more to the story, that he was basically a low-ranking lieutenant, that he's a patsy. And then he was just very quickly shipped off to a supermax prison and never heard from again. But at the same time, the son of El Chapo's business partner, Jesus Zambada, wrote in his court filings that he was actually a DEA informant and that the DEA had basically negotiated a deal with the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo's cartel, in which his cartel would be allowed to operate freely. And the US government, of course, denies these claims, and as they always do. Ever since then, his court case has basically been delayed indefinitely because of issues that have come out with discovery. And, I'd say that all of this raises very significant questions about the role of the US government in the drug war and whether or not we've collaborated with the organizations we claim to be fighting in the first place. What have we learned from his trial, and what questions do you think still remain?
Well, I mean, let's first remember that the involvement of U.S. institutions in collaborating, protecting, supporting drug traffickers is well documented, right? At different points of history, right? In the 1980s, the CIA used money and properties owned by traffickers to supply weapons to the Contra soldiers in Nicaragua, right? Then, of course, even Pablo Escobar's son claimed at some point that his dad was also working for the CIA, and that he had many contacts with the CIA throughout his years of as the head of the Medellin cartel. And so, it's, of course, it shouldn't be surprising that the U.S. keeps instrumentalizing, weaponizing traffickers for different purposes. Now, when it comes to the Chapo trial, of course, is very extraordinary to notice, like you just mentioned, that he was not allowed to speak much, but also how the very the very topics discussed during the trial were also very limited, right? At some points, the defense tried to argue for, thinking about corruption in the U.S. agencies. Of course, that was not allowed, and all that was left for them to do was to claim that he was not even the head of the cartel, right? That he was just a second in command, and that he would never really lead this organization. I remember very clearly when, in many of the instances that the head of El Chapo's defense team spoke in conferences, press conferences outside of the courthouse, he mentioned that he was really fighting against a perception for the most part, right? Not really there was a lot of evidence pinpointing what level of criminality his client had made, but the discourse itself already was judging that, and that was difficult to overcome. So what I find that is very fascinating in this whole discussion is that precisely the narrative itself and how it ends up imposing a political understanding of all of figures like El Chapo with very little evidence. Now, the evidence actually presented in court was very very strange, right? At some point, for example, they claimed that an operative of El Chapo had taken millions of dollars to the Mexican presidency residence, and that they had owned and paid for all kinds of favors from the Mexican government, but of course with no evidence at all whatsoever. But the evidence presented in the end did not even amount to much. I remember clearly that I think altogether the DA was able to prove about 14 billion for income of the so-called Sinaloa cartel, and of course all this money could hardly be attributed to one person, right? Especially somebody like El Chapo, as you mentioned, who was already basically living and trying to survive in the mountains, right? By the time of his capture. So it's very strange, how the myth has him living as a billionaire somewhere hidden in Mexico, when reality showed you a very impoverished man, betrayed by most associates, betrayed even by his lovers, right? And with no recourse to defense, and not even able to speak for himself, right? And so what I think it's extraordinary also is that at some point, I remember this very clearly, when he was first captured, there was a lot of speculation in Mexico of how a figure like that could reveal all the corruption on the Mexican side, right? All the corruption that had overtaken the very structures of government, all the way up to the president. And yet, no revelations were made, right? Other than absurd claims that they were funneling money to the Mexican president. So my point here is that these traffickers, of course, hold no secrets, right? They hold no political leverage. They have nothing to say, right? If they did some or anything relevant to say, of course the US would use it and weaponize it. But when they do say it, they usually say it after they become witnesses under the witness protection programs. And of course they make ridiculous claims that have no validity in US courts, much less in Mexican court, right?
I have one final question for you before we go, and it's about Trump. Trump has announced a new crackdown on cartels. I'm sure you saw it. He's ordered his Pentagon to now target them. Who knows what that will look like? What's your reaction to this new Pentagon directive, and what do you expect will come from it?
Yeah, well, what is very interesting is that the idea of trafficking, narco traffickers behaving as terrorists goes back to the 1980s, right? This is something that has been floated in US politics for a long while, right? From the Ronald Reagan administration, there was an effort to associate drug trafficking with terrorism, and throughout and since 1986, when there's to my knowledge, the first record of this association attempt from U.S. authorities, the U.S. government had tried to, at different stages, to link Mexican traffickers to terrorism. Most notoriously was Hillary Clinton, who tried to do so when she was a senator for the Democrats, and also when she was Secretary of State under Barack Obama. Right, there's a moment where she was trying to link organizations with insurgencies, right, with armed insurgencies. Even Obama had to rein her in a little bit into toning down those claims. And so, what is very important to understand is that Trump is not the sole articulator of this claim, right? To the contrary, I think this goes back to the longer history of the war on drugs. Now, I think Trump is the very first successful president to bring it together, right? To allow for a better consensus of it in U.S. Congress, and also with the help of border governors like Greg Abbott, right, in Texas, who consistently claim that traffickers behave like terrorists that are a menace to society and whatnot. And so what is really then important to see is that seeing cartels as terrorists allowed him now to escalate the claims of the war on drugs, right? And to put these organizations at the level of organizations like Hamas, right? And so at this moment, what we see then is that Mexico has become a territory of, that in the perspective of the US can be associated with the danger of Middle Eastern unruly societies like Gaza, for example, right? That of course now has suffered this horrendous state violence and genocide. And so what is then extraordinary is to look at Trump as somebody who's articulating a new era of security purposes, when perhaps the very instruments of killing that are used in Gaza may be veered towards the US-Mexico border, right? I don't know if how real this would be in terms of actually sending a drone into Mexican territory. I doubt that it is something that we will necessarily see, but it can definitely be used as a tool for extortion and coercion, right? And by leaking the very order to the New York Times the way they did, I feel that the Trump administration is trying to blackmail basically the Mexican government into their own designs, right?